War of the Bucket. Can you believe 30,000 soldiers were massacred over a wooden bucket? Today, we're seeing the story of the Battle of Zappolino, a simple insult that led to the bloodiest war in Italian history. On November 15, 1325, in the midst of bloody struggles between the rival Guelphs and Ghibellines, one of the largest medieval battles in history was recorded. The root of this conflict goes back to the long-standing competition between the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor. In July of that year, a group of daring soldiers from Modena secretly infiltrated the center of the city of Bologna and stole a wooden bucket from the public well of the city. This act was not a simple theft for wealth, but a symbolic gesture to challenge the authority and pride of the Bolognese. After this incident, the authorities in Bologna, unable to tolerate the insult, issued an official ultimatum demanding the return of the bucket. However, the mocking response from the Modenese caused Bologna to mobilize its largest army for a full-scale retaliation. The Bologna army, with a huge force of 30,000 infantry and 2,000 elite cavalry, marched toward Modena's borders. Meanwhile, the Modenese could only gather around 5,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry for defense. On November 15, 1325, the two armies faced each other in the Zappolino area. Despite Bologna's forces being almost 6 times the size of the enemy's, the disorganization in their ranks and the bold strategy of Modena's cavalry caused Bologna's defensive lines to break in less than 2 hours. The Battle of Zappolino turned into a real massacre, with about 2,000 casualties on both sides. The victorious Modenese pursued the fleeing Bolognese to the gates of their city. They even, on their return, stole a second bucket from a well outside the city to complete their conquest. After the war ended, despite mediation and peace treaties, the original bucket was never returned to Bologna. This bucket, made of oak wood, was kept as a sacred trophy in the Modena Cathedral for centuries, and later transferred to the town hall, to serve as a reminder of the victory in a war that started with a simple theft and ended with the deaths of thousands. War of Jenkins Ear. How did cutting off the ear of a simple captain spark one of the longest colonial wars? Let's see how Britain and Spain fought for 8 years over a wrinkled ear and caused thousands of deaths. In 1731, as trade and naval tensions between Great Britain and the Spanish Empire over trade rights in the Caribbean Sea reached their peak, a British ship under the command of a captain named Robert Jenkins was stopped by the Spanish Coast Guard off the coast of Florida on suspicion of smuggling. The Spanish commander, after boarding the ship and inspecting it, cut off the left ear of Captain Jenkins with his sword and told him to take this message to his king, that if he were here, the same thing would happen to him. Jenkins picked up his severed ear and preserved it in a jar of salt or alcohol. 8 years later, in 1739, when political opponents of the government in Britain were looking for a pretext to stir public outrage against Spain and end restrictive trade agreements, Jenkins was called before the House of Commons. He appeared before the members of Parliament and displayed his dried, shriveled ear as evidence of Spanish savagery. This symbolic act triggered a wave of nationalism and anger in London, and the British press, using this incident, swayed public opinion toward demanding war. As a result of this pressure, Britain officially declared war on Spain in October 1739. The war initially began with Britain's attacks on Spanish ports in Central America, but it gradually escalated into a much larger conflict, eventually merging into the larger War of the Austrian Succession. This conflict lasted for years and inflicted heavy human and financial losses on both empires, while everything started with the cutting of a simple captain's ear in the middle of the ocean. Pig War. How did the dumbest battle in American history begin over a $10 loss to a farmer? Today, you'll see the story of the Battle of San Juan, where the wisdom of one admiral prevented the slaughter of thousands of people over a pig. In 1859, on San Juan Island, located between the state of Washington, USA, and Vancouver Island, an incident occurred that brought 2 major world powers to the brink of a full-scale war. The root of this crisis lay in the ambiguity of the 1846 border treaty, which did not specify which country the strategic San Juan Island actually belonged to. As a result, both American citizens and employees of a British company had settled on the island. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler noticed that a large black pig was eating his potatoes on his land. Cutler, furious over the repeated incidents, shot the pig dead. When it was discovered that the pig belonged to an employee of the British company, Cutler offered to pay $10 in compensation. However, the pig's owner demanded $100. As the dispute escalated and the British threatened to arrest Cutler, American residents on the island called for help from the United States Army. Captain George Pickett arrived on the island with 66 American soldiers to protect the citizens of this country. The British, who saw this action as an invasion, sent 3 warships to the area. Over the course of several weeks, the situation worsened dramatically. and the U.S. Army increased its forces to nearly 500 men and 9 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, the British lined up on the shore with 5 warships and more than 1,200 soldiers. The British governor ordered that forces land to expel the Americans from the island, but Admiral Baines refused to carry out the order, saying that involving 2 great nations over a single pig was foolish. After 4 months of military stalemate and tension, news of the crisis reached Washington and London, and both governments were shocked by the massive scale of what had started as a small dispute. Eventually, the 2 countries agreed to jointly occupy the island militarily until a final resolution on the borders. This peaceful arrangement lasted for years, until in 1872, with the mediation of the German emperor, the island's ownership was officially transferred to the United States. This battle, known as the Pig War, is remembered in history as one of the few military conflicts where, despite a massive military buildup, the only casualty was the pig itself. Incident at Petrich. Can you believe that a dog caused Greece to declare war on Bulgaria and set fire to border villages? On October 22, 1925, relations between Greece and Bulgaria were highly tense due to territorial disputes following World War I. A Greek soldier, while on guard at his border post, noticed that his dog had crossed the border and entered Bulgarian territory. Ignoring the sensitivity of the border, he crossed the line to retrieve his dog. However, Bulgarian border guards who saw this as an aggressive act shot and killed him. This shooting immediately led to a fierce confrontation between soldiers from both sides, and another Greek officer who had gone forward with a white flag to mediate was also killed by Bulgarian forces. Upon hearing the news, the dictatorial government of Theodoros Pangalos in Athens gave Bulgaria an ultimatum of 48 hours, demanding a formal apology, punishment of the perpetrators, and the payment of 2 million francs in compensation. When Bulgaria refused these terms, Greece issued a military order to attack. Greek forces crossed the border and advanced toward the city of Petrich, capturing several border villages. At the time, Bulgaria had a weak army due to the limitations of the peace treaty, so it complained to the League of Nations, asking for immediate intervention. Following this request, the League of Nations sent peacekeepers and issued an immediate ceasefire order, threatening Greece with heavy sanctions if they did not retreat. Under international pressure, the Greek army was forced to withdraw from Bulgarian territory, and the League of Nations Investigative Commission found Greece to be the main culprit, ordering the country to pay £45,000 in compensation to Bulgaria. This brief conflict, which resulted in the deaths of around 50 people, demonstrated how a seemingly trivial incident, like a dog running away, could lead to a devastating war due to old grievances. Pastry War. How could a simple baker convince the King of France to declare war on another country to claim 600,000 pesos in compensation, in a place where the appetite of a few soldiers led to the most expensive compensation in history for Mexico? In 1828, a French baker named Monsieur Remontel claimed that during street riots in the Tacubaya area near Mexico City, Mexican army officers looted his bakery and ate his pastries. He sent a letter to the King of France, Louis Philippe, requesting that the Mexican government pay him a hefty 60,000 pesos in damages. While the actual value of his shop was far less than this amount, the Mexican government, already burdened with heavy foreign debt, ignored this request and other claims from French citizens. France took the matter seriously and demanded Mexico pay a total of 600,000 pesos in compensation. After Mexican president's refusal to accept this ultimatum, the French naval fleet, under the command of Admiral Charles Baudin, was sent to the Gulf of Mexico and blockaded the country's main port, Veracruz. Tensions peaked in December 1838, and French forces bombarded the San Juan de Ulua fortress and took control of it. This war saw the return of Antonio López de Santa Anna, who, while commanding the Mexican forces in this battle, lost his leg during one of the confrontations from a French cannonball. Eventually, through British mediation, worried about halting their trade in the region, a peace treaty was signed, according to which Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos in compensation to France. This short but bloody conflict left hundreds dead and wounded. The Hamburger Hill. Can you believe that after 11 bloody assaults and 10 days of hand-to-hand combat, the U.S. Army simply abandoned the hill they had captured? On May 10, 1969, during the Vietnam War, the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army was tasked with capturing a hill at 937 meters high, which was one of the strongest fortifications of the North Vietnamese Army due to the steepness of the mountain, dense jungle vegetation, and torrential rains. The U.S. soldiers' advance toward the summit was extraordinarily difficult. The North Vietnamese forces were hiding in deep tunnels and concrete bunkers, and repeatedly repelled the U.S. infantry's attacks near the summit using machine guns and grenades. The intensity of the fighting and the volume of fire was so great that the hill's vegetation was completely destroyed, and the soil turned into a pile of mud. The American soldiers, due to the horrific casualties and the deaths of their comrades under heavy fire, named the location Hamburger Hill. They believed the hill was like a meat grinder, turning humans into ground meat. After 10 continuous days of battle and 11 direct ground assaults, supported by heavy airstrikes and the use of napalm, the U.S. forces finally captured the summit on May 20th. But what turned this battle into a political and military tragedy was what happened after the victory. Only 5 days after capturing the hill, and despite more than 70 U.S. soldiers and hundreds of Vietnamese being killed, the senior U.S. military commanders ordered the evacuation and abandonment of the hill. They argued that the hill no longer held strategic value. This decision sparked a wave of anger and disbelief among the soldiers and the American public. The pressure from public opinion after this incident forced the U.S. government to shift its strategy from direct attacks on enemy positions to a more defensive approach. Whiskey Rebellion. What would make George Washington have to put on battle gear and command 13,000 soldiers just to enforce attacks on a drink? In 1791, just a few years after the United States independence, the fledgling government of the country, at the suggestion of Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, passed a law to impose a tax on distilled alcoholic beverages to pay off the heavy debts incurred from the Revolutionary War. For farmers in the border regions of western Pennsylvania, whiskey was not just a drink, but due to the difficulty of transporting grain through the mountains, they turned their wheat and corn into whiskey to ensure greater preservation and to use it as a unit of currency in trade. These farmers, who saw the new tax as unjust and reminiscent of the taxes imposed by the British, refused to pay it and resorted to violent protests. Tensions peaked in 1794 when a group of armed rebels attacked the home of one of the tax inspectors and set it on fire. As the unrest spread and there was fear of the collapse of public order, President George Washington made an unprecedented decision. After issuing a statement and giving an ultimatum to the rebels, he personally put on battle gear and took command of a force of 13,000 soldiers. This was the only time in U.S. history that an incumbent president personally led military forces on the battlefield. As this massive army approached western Pennsylvania, the rebels, unable to face such power, disbanded, and resistance collapsed without a bloody battle. Although this military campaign seemed just to enforce a tax on one drink, Washington proved with this action that the central government had the power and will to enforce federal laws and suppress internal rebellions. War of the Salts. What happens if a substance you use every day causes the death of dozens of people and the execution of Texas Rangers? In 1877, a long-standing dispute over the ownership of natural resources turned into one of the bloodiest non-military conflicts. For centuries, Mexican-American settlers, according to ancient traditions, had considered the salt lakes at the foot of the Guadalupe Mountains to be public property, using its salt to preserve food and trade. However, as American politicians and merchants gained power, a man named Charles Howard, using new land ownership laws, attempted to register these lakes in his name so he could charge people who had previously harvested salt for free a high fee and tax. This action was seen by the local community as theft of public resources, and when Howard arrested 2 locals for attempting to collect salt, it sparked a massive armed rebellion. Tensions quickly escalated, and an angry crowd surrounded Howard. He was only freed when he swore to abandon his claim and leave the area. However, Howard later returned with the support of a group of Texas Rangers, and he killed a popular local leader. This act led to hundreds of armed locals, laying siege to the town of San Elizario. After several days of fierce fighting, the Texas Rangers were forced to surrender for the first time in their history, and Howard, along with 2 of his companions, was executed by a firing squad of rebels. As this border chaos expanded and fears of the collapse of law and order grew, the U.S. government intervened and sent military forces to the region, which caused many rebels to flee to Mexico. This bloody conflict, which was fought over the right to access a simple raw material, salt, ultimately ended with the permanent stationing of the military in the region and the end of the people's traditional right to public resources in favor of private owners. Football War. Can you believe that the result of a soccer match for qualifying for the World Cup led to the death of 3,000 people and the start of an all-out war? In 1969, while deep social and economic tensions between El Salvador and Honduras had reached a peak due to border disputes and the widespread expulsion of Salvadoran immigrants, a series of soccer matches to qualify for the 1970 World Cup sparked a bloody battle. More than 300,000 Salvadoran farmers had migrated to Honduras in search of land, but the Honduran government, through new land reform laws, began to confiscate land. and expel these migrants violently. In such a context, the two national teams faced each other in the qualifiers. The first match in Honduras ended with a victory for the host, and the second match in El Salvador ended with a win for El Salvador. Both matches were accompanied by street riots, attacks on rival fans, and desecration of each other's national symbols. After the third game in Mexico City, which ended with a 3-2 victory for El Salvador, diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed entirely, and the drums of war began to sound. On July 14, 1969, the Salvadoran Air Force launched a surprise attack on airports and military bases in Honduras, beginning the invasion. Simultaneously, the country's ground forces advanced along main roads toward Honduran territory. Honduras, with its superior air force, attacked Salvadoran oil facilities and military bases. This war lasted only 100 hours, but it left heavy human casualties, resulting in the deaths of approximately 2,000 to 3,000 people, most of whom were civilians. Finally, with the intervention of the Organization of American States and the threat of international sanctions, a ceasefire was established, and Salvadoran forces withdrew from the occupied areas in early August. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to follow the channel and share your suggestions for future videos in the comments section.